The reception was held in the museum's grand ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables adorned with white roses and gold ribbons. I was mingling with guests, accepting congratulations and sharing stories about Daniel's childhood, when Madeline approached me with a champagne flute in her hand and something sharp in her smile. "Evelyn," she said, her voice carrying that saccharine sweetness I'd grown to recognize as a warning sign. "We need to talk." I excused myself from the conversation I was having with Robert's old business partners and followed her to a relatively quiet corner of the room. Even there, we were surrounded by guests, family friends, cousins, colleagues from Daniel's law firm. "What is it, dear?" I asked, though something in her posture already had me on guard. Madeline set down her champagne and extended her perfectly manicured hand, palm up. "I'll need the keys to the house now." I blinked, certain I'd misheard her. "I'm sorry." "The keys to your house. Our house now. Daniel and I will be moving in next week, and I want to start planning the renovations immediately." The audacity of her demand hit me like a physical blow. My house, the Victorian mansion on Rainbow Row that Robert and I had spent 30 years restoring, where we'd raised Daniel, where every room held decades of memories, was not hers to claim. "Madeline," I said carefully, keeping my voice low, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. That house is my home. You and Daniel are welcome to visit any time, of course, but—" "There's no misunderstanding," she interrupted, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "Daniel is your only child. That house will be ours eventually, anyway. I'm just asking you to make the transition easier for everyone." I felt the familiar weight of my pearl necklace against my throat as I straightened my shoulders. "The answer is no, Madeline. My home is not up for discussion." The transformation in her face was startling. The sweet smile vanished, replaced by something ugly and entitled. Her voice carried across the room now, drawing stares and hushed conversations. "Are you seriously going to make this difficult? On my wedding day? You're going to embarrass your son because you're too selfish to share?" "I'm not making anything difficult," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I'm simply declining to hand over the deed to my property to someone who has no legal or moral claim to it." That's when Madeline did something that changed everything between us forever. She reached out with both hands and gave me a hard shove, sending me stumbling backward. My heels caught in the hem of my dress, and I fell to the polished marble floor with a sickening thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent ballroom. But she wasn't finished. As I lay there, stunned and struggling to process what had just happened, Madeline leaned over me and spat directly in my face. The warm saliva hit my cheek and ran down toward my pearl earrings. "You pathetic old woman," she hissed, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Your time is over. This is my family now." 200 guests stared in shocked silence. My own son stood frozen by the head table, his face pale but his feet planted firmly in place. Not one person moved to help me, except Grace Hale, Robert's best friend's wife, who rushed over with her husband Richard to help me to my feet. "Evelyn, dear God, are you hurt?" Grace whispered, pressing her napkin to my face to wipe away the spit. I accepted her help standing, straightened my dress, and looked directly at Madeline. She stood there with her hands on her hips, looking triumphant, as if she'd just won some great victory. "No, Grace," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "I'm not hurt, but I am enlightened." I reached into my small evening purse and pulled out my phone. With steady fingers, I scrolled to a contact I hoped I'd never have to use and pressed call. "Richard," I said when he answered, never taking my eyes off Madeline's face. "It's Evelyn. I need you and Thomas at the Gibby's Museum immediately." "Yes, now. Thank you." Madeline's triumphant expression began to waver. "Who did you just call?" I smiled, The same polite smile I'd perfected over decades of charity luncheons and society events. "Just some old friends, dear. They'll be here shortly." The tension in the room was suffocating. Guests whispered behind their hands, some already reaching for their phones to capture what would surely become the scandal of Charleston's social season. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom, maybe we should talk about this privately." "No," I said, looking at my son with disappointment that cut deeper than his wife's physical assault. "I think we've done quite enough talking for one evening." For 30 minutes, I stood in that ballroom, accepting concerned whispers from genuine friends while enduring the curious stares of social climbers who smelled gossip. Madeline tried to salvage the situation, moving through the crowd with forced laughter and explanations about family disagreements and wedding stress. But I simply waited. At exactly 9:17 p.m., two men in dark suits entered the ballroom. Richard Hale, my late husband's business partner and the executor of my estate, walked with the measured stride of a man who'd spent 50 years handling delicate legal matters. Beside him, Thomas Reed moved with the quiet intensity of someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, which, in his profession as a private investigator, was often literally true. The moment Madeline saw them, her face went white as her wedding dress. "Mrs. Whitmore," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older power, "we came as quickly as we could." I watched as Madeline grabbed Daniel's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. She knew exactly who these men were and why their appearance meant trouble for her. "Thank you both for coming," I said. "I believe it's time to go home." Thomas Reed's eyes swept the room once, cataloging faces and reactions with professional precision, before settling on Madeline. She actually took a step backward. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Your car is waiting outside." As I walked toward the exit, flanked by two of the most powerful men in Charleston's legal and investigative communities, I heard Madeline's voice crack for the first time that evening. "Evelyn, wait. Can't we discuss this like adults?" I paused at the ballroom entrance and turned back to look at her, this girl who thought she could humiliate me in front of 200 people and face no consequences. "Oh, my dear Madeline," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "We just did." And with that, I walked out of my son's wedding reception, leaving behind a daughter-in-law who had no idea what she'd just unleashed. The war, as they say, had begun. But unlike Madeline, I had been preparing for this battle my entire life. The ride home from the museum was silent except for the gentle hum of Richard's Mercedes and the soft jazz playing from the radio. I sat in the back seat, staring out at the familiar streets of Charleston's historic district, while my mind cataloged every detail of what had just transpired. "Evelyn," Richard finally said as we turned onto Rainbow Row, "are you certain about this course of action? Once we begin, there's no going back." I touched my pearl necklace, feeling the smooth surface that had been worn by 3 generations of strong women in my family. "She spat on me, Richard. In front of our entire social circle. In front of my son. And he did nothing." Thomas Reed glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "I've been investigating Madeline Clark for 3 months, ever since you first expressed concerns about your son's engagement. What I've found, it's extensive." "Tell me." "Not here," he said, pulling into my driveway. "Inside, where we can speak freely. My house, the house Madeline had demanded keys to, stood before us like a fortress of memory and tradition. Built in 1847, the 3-story Victorian had been in Robert's family for over a century before we bought it from his elderly aunt. We'd spent our entire marriage restoring it room by room, turning it into something that belonged in architectural magazines. The front garden was my pride and joy, with climbing jasmine that perfumed the evening air and rose bushes that had been featured in Southern Living. The wraparound porch held rocking chairs where Robert and I used to sit every evening, planning our future and sharing our dreams. This house wasn't just property to me. It was my legacy, my sanctuary, my proof that love could build something lasting in a world full of temporary things. And Madeline Clark thought she could take it with a simple demand and an act of violence. Once inside, I poured 3 glasses of Robert's best bourbon while the men settled into the living room. The space was elegant but comfortable, with antique furniture mixed with pieces Robert and I had collected during our travels. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. Our wedding day, Daniel's childhood, Christmas mornings, anniversary celebrations. "Now," I said, settling into my favorite armchair, "tell me everything you've discovered about my new daughter-in-law." Thomas opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the coffee table. Madeline Clark has been operating under multiple identities for the past 10 years. Her real name is Madison Clark, with an E, and she's originally from a trailer park in rural Alabama. I studied the photographs he'd laid out. Driver's licenses, credit applications, court documents, all bearing variations of Madeline's face and different names. "She's been married twice before," Thomas continued, "both to older men with substantial assets. The first husband died in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs. The second divorced her when he discovered she'd been forging his signature on loan documents." Richard leaned forward, his expression grim. "There's more, Evelyn. She's been systematically stealing from Daniel for months. Credit cards taken out in his name, cash advances, even a second mortgage on his condominium that he doesn't know about." The bourbon burned my throat as I absorbed this information. My son, my only child, was being manipulated and robbed by a woman he thought loved him. "How much has she taken?" "Conservative estimate? About $200,000, Thomas said. "She's also been building a case for claiming Daniel is mentally incompetent. She's been recording his conversations, documenting every moment of stress or confusion, building a portfolio to support a conservatorship claim." The scope of Madeline's deception was breathtaking. She hadn't just married my son for his modest attorney's salary and eventual inheritance. She was systematically destroying his finances while positioning herself to control his life completely. "There's something else," Thomas said, pulling out another set of documents. "She's been researching you extensively, Mrs. Whitmore. Your assets, your properties, your investment portfolio. She knows exactly how much you're worth, and she's been planning this takeover for months." I set down my bourbon glass and walked to the front windows, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 30 years. Neighbors walking their dogs, couples strolling hand in hand, the peaceful rhythm of a life I'd built through decades of hard work and careful planning. "She thinks I'm just some weak old woman who'll roll over and die to make room for her," I said. "Are you?" Richard asked gently. I turned back to face the 2 men who had been Robert's closest friends and were now my most trusted allies. In their eyes, I saw the same determination that had helped them build successful careers and navigate Charleston's complex social and business networks. "Gentlemen," I said, returning to my chair with renewed purpose, "Madeline Clark made a critical error tonight. She showed her hand too early. She revealed her true nature in front of 200 witnesses before she'd secured what she wanted." "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my contacts, stopping at Daniel's name. For a moment, I hesitated. He was my son, the child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. But he was also a grown man who had chosen to stand by and watch while his wife assaulted me. "I'm thinking that my son and his new wife are about to learn the difference between wanting something and earning it," I said, deleting his contact information. "Richard, first thing Monday morning, I want Daniel removed from every account, trust, and legal document that bears his name." "Evelyn, that's quite drastic." "Is it?" I interrupted. He watched his wife push me to the ground and spit in my face, and he did nothing. Nothing, Richard. A stranger would have shown more decency. Richard nodded slowly. I'll have the paperwork ready by noon Monday. Thomas, I want to know everything about Madeline's past, her current activities, and her future plans. Every detail, every secret, every vulnerability. Can you do that? Already in progress, he said, tapping his portfolio. Give me 2 weeks, and I'll have enough information to bury her. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up my favorite photograph of Robert. He was standing in this very room, his arms around me, both of us laughing at something Daniel had said. He looked so alive, so proud of the life we'd built together. What would Robert want me to do? I asked more to myself than to the men. He'd want you to protect yourself and your legacy, Richard said firmly. And he'd want justice for what was done to you tonight. I set down the photograph and returned to my chair. The decision was made, had probably been made the moment Madeline's spit hit my face. Then that's exactly what we'll do, I said. But not through lawyers or courts or public spectacle. We're going to dismantle Madeline Clark's life the same way she's been trying to dismantle mine, quietly, systematically, and completely. What about Daniel? Richard asked. I looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece, at all the memories of raising a son who had grown into a man I barely recognized. Daniel made his choice tonight when he chose silence over defending his mother. Now he'll live with the consequences of that choice. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times as we finalized our plans. By the time Richard and Thomas left, the foundation for Madeline Clark's destruction was already in place. I poured myself another bourbon and walked out onto the front porch, settling into the rocking chair where Robert and I had spent countless evenings planning our future. The night air was warm and fragrant with jasmine, and the street was peaceful under the glow of antique street lamps. Somewhere across town, my son was probably trying to salvage what was left of his wedding reception while his new wife spun stories about family drama and misunderstandings. She would be confident now, believing she'd won some great victory by humiliating me in public. She had no idea that her real education was just beginning. I rocked gently in Robert's chair, planning the systematic destruction of the woman who thought she could steal my life, and smiled into the Charleston night. The game, as they say, was afoot. Monday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes Charleston look like a postcard. I woke at 6, as I had every day for 40 years, and followed my usual routine: coffee on the back terrace, a review of the morning papers, and a careful application of makeup and jewelry that would armor me for whatever the day might bring. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in Richard Hale's office, signing documents that would forever change my son's financial future. This removes Daniel as beneficiary from your life insurance policy, Richard explained, sliding another paper across his mahogany desk. And this eliminates his power of attorney privileges. I signed each document with steady hands, my grandmother's pearl bracelet catching the light from Richard's office windows. Each signature felt like cutting a thread that had bound me to a child who had grown into someone I no longer recognized. The trust fund modifications will be more complex, Richard continued. Daniel has been receiving monthly distributions since he turned 30. Terminating that income will have immediate consequences. Good, I said. Perhaps financial pressure will help him understand the gravity of his choices. Richard studied me over his reading glasses. Evelyn, do you understand that this action is irreversible? Once these documents are filed, Daniel will have no legal claim to your estate. I set down my pen and looked out at the Charleston harbor, where sailboats moved gracefully across water that sparkled like diamonds. Somewhere in the city, my son was probably starting his first day as a married man, blissfully unaware that his financial safety net had just vanished. Richard, I said, last Saturday night, a woman I'd met only 6 months ago felt entitled to demand the keys to my home. When I refused, she assaulted me in front of 200 people. And my son, The child I raised, educated, and supported for 32 years stood there and watched. I understand your anger. This isn't anger, I interrupted. This is clarity. Daniel had a choice that night between defending his mother and appeasing his wife. He chose appeasement. Now he can live with that choice without the cushion of my financial support. Richard nodded and continued with the paperwork. By noon, every legal document that had connected my son to my wealth had been severed. Daniel Whitmore was now a man entirely dependent on his own resources and whatever his new wife might contribute to their partnership, which, based on Thomas Reed's investigation, was considerably less than nothing. My next stop was First National Bank, where I'd conducted business for over 30 years. Margaret Hutchinson, the branch manager, greeted me with the warm professionalism reserved for the bank's most valued clients. Mrs. Whitmore, how wonderful to see you. I trust you enjoyed Daniel's wedding? The photos in the society pages were beautiful. I wondered what Margaret would say if she knew those same society photographers had captured images of me being pushed to the ground by the bride. But Charleston's social machinery was nothing if not discreet about family scandals. It was quite memorable, I said. Margaret, I need to make some changes to my accounts. Within an hour, I had closed every joint account, removed Daniel's name from my safety deposit box access, and canceled the credit cards I'd provided him for emergencies. I also instructed the bank to flag any attempts to use Daniel's previous authorization codes as potentially fraudulent. The final stop was my attorney's office, where I updated my will. Everything I owned, the house, the investment portfolio, the vacation property in Kiowa Island, even my jewelry, would now go to carefully selected charities and the few friends who had remained loyal over the years. Daniel's name didn't appear anywhere in the new document. As I drove home that afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the caller display, but I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had 7 missed calls from my son. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the front porch to listen to his messages. The first few were confused. Mom, I tried to access the emergency account today, and the bank said it was closed. Can you call me? By the 4th message, panic had crept into his voice. Mom, my credit card was declined at lunch. There seems to be some kind of problem with our accounts. Please call me back. The final 3 messages revealed the full scope of his predicament. Mom, I went to the bank and they said you'd removed my access to everything. I don't understand what's happening. Madeline is furious. She says this is some kind of punishment for the wedding, but I'm sure that's not. Please, Mom, call me back. We need to talk about this. I deleted all 7 messages without responding. That evening, Grace Hale called to check on me. How are you holding up, dear? She asked. Richard told me what you accomplished today. That was quite decisive. It was necessary, I said. Grace, did you see the way people looked at me on Saturday night? After Madeline pushed me down? I saw pity, Evelyn. And shame. People were ashamed that such a thing could happen in their presence. Exactly. They pitied me. They saw a weak old woman who couldn't defend herself against a young bully. I set down my wine glass and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Robert and I had planted together. I will not be pitied, Grace. Not by anyone. What will you do when Daniel comes here? Because he will come. Tonight, probably. She was right, of course. Daniel would drive straight here as soon as he realized the extent of what I'd done. He would stand on my front porch and demand explanations, plead for understanding, maybe even bring Madeline to charm or intimidate me into reversing my decisions. I'll do what I should have done years ago, I said. I'll let him stand on his own 2 feet without my financial support holding him up. At exactly 8:43 p.m., Daniel's BMW pulled into my driveway. Through the front window, I watched him sit in the car for several minutes, probably gathering courage for a conversation he'd never imagined having to have. When he finally approached the front door, I was waiting in the living room with a cup of tea and a book, the picture of elderly contentment.
His key didn't work.
I'd had the locks changed that afternoon. The doorbell rang once, twice, 3 times before I rose to answer it. Daniel stood on my porch looking haggard and confused, his usually perfect attorney's appearance disheveled from what had obviously been a stressful day. "Mom," he said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God you're home. Something terrible has happened with the bank accounts." "Has it?" I asked, not inviting him inside. "Yes, they're saying you closed everything, removed my access, even canceled my credit cards. But that can't be right because you would have discussed something like that with me first." I studied my son's face, looking for any sign of the little boy I'd once known. He was still handsome, though stress had added lines around his eyes, and his sandy brown hair was showing premature gray at the temples. He looked so much like Robert at that age. But when I looked deeper, past the familiar features, I saw someone I barely recognized. A man who had watched his wife assault his mother and chosen silence over courage. "Actually, Daniel, it's completely right. I did close the accounts and remove your access. I also updated my will, terminated your trust fund, and removed you as beneficiary from my life insurance." His face went white.
What?
"Mom, you can't be serious. Why would you?" "Where is your wife?" I asked. "She's at home. Mom, this is between us. Madeline doesn't need to be involved in family financial matters." "Doesn't she?" Because on Saturday night, Madeline felt quite comfortable involving herself in family matters. Specifically, she felt entitled to demand keys to my house and assault me when I refused. Daniel's shoulders sagged. "Mom, about that. I know it looked bad, but Madeline was stressed about the wedding. She'd had champagne, and sometimes she says things she doesn't mean." She pushed me to the ground and spat in my face. "I know, and I'm sorry, but... And you did nothing." The words hung between us like a blade. Daniel opened his mouth several times, but couldn't seem to find words that would make this conversation go the way he needed it to go. "Mom." I was in shock. It happened so fast, and I didn't know how to react. "You knew exactly how to react, Daniel. You chose not to." I stepped back and began to close the door, but he put his hand out to stop me. "Please, Mom, don't do this. I know you're hurt, but cutting me off financially isn't going to solve anything. Madeline and I need that money. We have expenses plans. Then I suggest you figure out how to pay for those expenses and plans with your own resources." "But Mom, the house payments alone are more than I make. And Madeline has been..." He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd been about to reveal something he didn't want me to know. "Madeline has been what, Daniel?" His silence told me everything I needed to know. Thomas Reed's investigation had been correct. My son's new wife had been systematically draining his finances, and he'd been covering the shortfall with money from me. "I see," I said. "Well, I suppose you and Madeline will need to have a conversation about family budgeting. Good night, Daniel." This time, when I closed the door, I also engaged the deadbolt. He stood on my porch for another 10 minutes, alternately knocking and calling my name, but I didn't respond. Eventually, I heard his car start and drive away. I returned to my chair, my book, and my tea, feeling more at peace than I had in months. Phase 1 of Madeline's education was complete. Now the real work would begin. Thomas Reed's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted antebellum mansion on Broad Street, its windows offering a view of Charleston's bustling legal district. Unlike the polished mahogany and brass of Richard's law firm, Thomas's space felt more like a detective's den from a noir film. Filing cabinets, computer monitors, and cork boards covered with photographs and documents connected by red string. "I've been busy since we last spoke," Thomas said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from his cluttered desk. "Your instincts about Madeline were correct, but the reality is worse than we imagined." He opened a thick manila folder and began spreading photographs and documents across the desk surface. My new daughter-in-law's face stared back at me from dozens of images, driver's licenses, marriage certificates, arrest records, credit applications. "Let's start with her real background," Thomas said. Madison Clark was born in Dothan, Alabama, to parents who were both serving time for methamphetamine distribution. She was raised by her grandmother in a single-wide trailer until age 16, when she ran away. I studied a photograph of a younger Madeline, thinner, harder-looking, with the desperate eyes of someone who'd seen too much too young. Her first arrest was at 17 for shoplifting, then credit card fraud at 19. She served 8 months in county jail for that one. Thomas pulled out another set of documents. That's where she learned to forge signatures and manipulate financial documents. And the marriages you mentioned? Husband number 1 was Marcus Webb, a 63-year-old widower she met at a church in Mobile. He owned a small construction company and had a modest life insurance policy. They were married for exactly 11 months before he fell down the stairs of his own home and broke his neck. Thomas showed me the police report and coroner's findings. The death was ruled accidental, but I spoke with the investigating officer. He said there were some inconsistencies in Madeline's story, but not enough evidence to pursue charges. What kind of inconsistencies? Webb's body showed defensive wounds on his hands, like he'd tried to break a fall or fight off an attacker. And neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the house that night, despite Madeline's claims that she was at her book club. The photograph of Marcus Webb showed a kind-faced man with gentle eyes, someone who probably never imagined his young bride was capable of murder. Husband number 2 was Gerald Hutchins, a retired pharmaceutical executive in Savannah, Thomas continued. Much wealthier than Webb, investment portfolio worth about $2 million, plus a historic home in the Victorian district. What happened to him? He survived, barely. Hutchins discovered that Madeline had been forging his signature on loan documents and had already stolen about $400,000. When he confronted her, she claimed it was all a misunderstanding and begged for forgiveness. Thomas pulled out a police report. 2 days later, Hutchins was found unconscious at the bottom of his basement stairs. When he regained consciousness, he remembered Madeline pushing him. This time, the police believed the victim. She was arrested, charged with attempted murder and fraud, but she disappeared before the trial, changed her name again, altered her appearance, and vanished into the wind. I felt a chill run down my spine. This woman, this predator, was now legally married to my son and living in our city, with access to our social circle and all the wealthy, trusting people in it. How did she find Daniel? That's the most disturbing part, Thomas said, pulling out a timeline covered with red annotations. She didn't find him accidentally. Madeline researched Charleston's eligible bachelors for months before settling on your son as her target. He showed me printed pages from social media, charity event photos, and society page clippings. She studied his routine, his favorite restaurants, his social circle. The chance meeting at the art gallery opening? She planned it. She knew he'd be there because he'd attended the same event for 3 consecutive years. The scope of Madeline's manipulation was breathtaking. She'd orchestrated their entire relationship, from their first conversation to his marriage proposal. But Daniel isn't wealthy enough to be worth this level of planning, I said. His attorney's salary is comfortable, but hardly fortune-hunting territory. Thomas smiled grimly and pulled out another set of documents. He wasn't the real target, Mrs. Whitmore. You were. The files he showed me contained detailed research on my background, my late husband's business success, our property holdings, my investment portfolio, even photographs of my home taken from public areas. Madeline spent months learning everything about your family's financial situation. She knew that Daniel was your only heir, that you were a widow with substantial assets, and that you had a reputation for being generous with family. So marrying Daniel was just a means to an end.
Exactly.
The plan was to become your beloved daughter-in-law, slowly gain your trust, and then position herself to inherit everything when you died. If natural death took too long, well. He gestured to the police reports from her previous husbands. I set down the photographs and walked to Thomas's window, looking down at the busy street where people hurried about their daily lives, unaware of the predators moving among them. "There's more," Thomas said. Since marrying Daniel, Madeline has been accelerating her timeline. She's already researched your daily routine, your healthcare providers, and your legal representatives. What do you mean? He showed me a series of credit reports and financial inquiries. She's been making discreet inquiries about your medical history, claiming to be a concerned daughter-in-law who wants to understand your health needs. She's also researched your attorney, your accountant, and your doctors. The implications were terrifying. Madeline hadn't just married my son for money. She was actively planning my death. "Thomas, I need you to document everything. Every crime, every victim, every piece of evidence that proves what she's been doing." "Already done," he said, patting a thick folder. "I've also been in contact with the police departments in Mobile and Savannah. They're very interested in our Miss Clark's current whereabouts." I returned to my chair and studied the evidence spread across Thomas's desk. Each document told a story of manipulation, theft, and violence. But more than that, they painted a picture of a woman who had never faced real consequences for her actions. What about Daniel?
Does he know any of this?
Thomas shook his head. "I don't think he has a clue. Madeline has been very careful to maintain her sweet, innocent facade around him. But, Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you need to know about your son's financial situation." He pulled out another set of documents, bank statements, credit reports, loan applications. "Daniel is in serious financial trouble. Beyond what you suspected. Madeline has been using his identity to secure loans, credit lines, and cash advances. She's also been intercepting his mail to hide the extent of the debt." The numbers on the page made me dizzy. Credit card balances in the tens of thousands, personal loans, a second mortgage on Daniel's condominium that had been taken out just 2 weeks before the wedding. How much does he owe? Conservative estimate? About $350,000. And most of it was accumulated in the past 6 months, since Madeline moved in with him. I felt sick. My son wasn't just married to a murderer. He was financially ruined and didn't even know it. "The wedding," I said suddenly. "All that expense, the designer dress, the elaborate reception. Paid for with borrowed money. Money that Daniel thinks came from wedding gifts and family contributions, but actually came from fraudulent loans in his name." The cruelty of Madeline's plan was staggering. She wasn't just stealing from Daniel, she was systematically destroying his life, while making him think she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "Thomas, I want you to compile all of this evidence and prepare it for law enforcement."
But not yet.
"First, I want Madeline to understand that her perfect plan is falling apart." "What do you have in mind?" I gathered up the photographs of Madeline's previous victims, Marcus Webb, Gerald Hutchins, and who knows how many others who hadn't survived or hadn't been identified. I'm going to let her know that she's not as clever as she thinks, and that some prey fights back. That afternoon, I drove to Daniel's condominium in the historic district. It was a beautiful property in a converted antebellum mansion, the kind of place that looked impressive but came with crushing monthly maintenance fees and hidden costs. I parked across the street and waited. At 3:47 p.m., Madeline emerged from the building carrying shopping bags from expensive boutiques. Even from a distance, I could see the satisfaction in her posture, the walk of a woman who believed she'd won everything she wanted. I followed her discreetly as she made her way through Charleston's shopping district, stopping at jewelry stores, art galleries, and designer clothing shops. She was spending money like someone who had unlimited access to it, which until Monday she had believed she did. My phone rang as I watched her examine expensive handbags in a boutique window. Mrs. Whitmore? It was Thomas. I thought you should know. Daniel just received notice that his credit card payments are overdue. Multiple cards. And the bank is calling in the second mortgage. Perfect timing. How long before he realizes the extent of the problem? Based on the payment schedule, I'd say he'll know everything within the week. Maybe sooner if Madeline tries to use the cards that have been frozen. I watched as Madeline tried to make a purchase and apparently had her card declined. Even from across the street, I could see her confusion and growing agitation as she tried a second card, then a third. Her perfect plan was beginning to unravel, just as I'd intended. That evening, I received a text message from Daniel. Mom, can we please talk? Something strange is happening with my accounts. I deleted the message without responding. An hour later, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Daniel and Madeline standing on my porch. He looked stressed and confused. She looked furious. I didn't answer the door. They stood there for 20 minutes, alternately knocking and calling my name. At one point, I heard Madeline's voice rise to an almost hysterical pitch. She can't do this to us. She can't just cut us off. But I could, and I had. When they finally left, I poured myself a glass of wine and called Grace Hale. How did it go today? She asked. Better than expected. Madeline is starting to understand that her situation has changed dramatically. And Daniel? I was quiet for a moment, thinking about my son's face at the door, the confusion, the desperation, the slow realization that his financial security had vanished overnight. Daniel is learning that actions have consequences, and that the mother he took for granted might not be as helpless as he assumed. Evelyn, are you sure about this path? There's no going back once word gets out about what you've done. I walked to the front window and looked out at the street where I'd lived for 30 years. Tomorrow, the gossip would begin in earnest. People would whisper about the Whitmore family drama, about the wedding night humiliation and its aftermath. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own story. Grace, that woman spit in my face in front of 200 people. She married my son to steal my fortune and probably murder me for it. If I don't stop her, she'll destroy Daniel completely and then move on to her next victim. So, this isn't just about revenge? I smiled, thinking about Marcus Webb and Gerald Hutchins and all the other victims who hadn't been strong enough or smart enough to fight back. Oh, it's definitely about revenge. But it's also about justice. And sometimes, those two things are exactly the same. Phase 2 of Madeline's education was well underway. Soon, she would learn that some elderly women bite back when cornered, and their bite could be fatal. The story of Evelyn's methodical revenge continues to unfold in ways that will shock you. But before we see what happens next, I want to remind you that if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of standing up for yourself. Your support means everything to our community of strong women. Now, let's see how Evelyn's plan reaches its next devastating phase. The first crack in Madeline's facade appeared on Thursday morning. I was tending to my rose garden when I heard shouting from the street. Through my garden gate, I could see Daniel's BMW parked haphazardly in front of my house, and both my son and his wife standing on the sidewalk in what was clearly a heated argument. Told you this would happen, Madeline was saying, her voice shrill with panic. I told you your mother was a vindictive old woman. She's not vindictive, Daniel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. She's hurt. If we just explain. Explain what? That I pushed her at the wedding? That was an accident. I was emotional. I'd been drinking. You spat on her, Madeline. The silence that followed was deafening. I continued pruning my roses, but I was listening to every word. I was overwrought, Madeline said finally, her voice now calculated and controlled. It was our wedding night. I was stressed about the family dynamics, and I made a mistake. But Daniel, your mother has cut off all our money over one moment of weakness." "It wasn't a moment of weakness," Daniel said quietly. "It was cruel, and I should have stopped you." Progress, I thought. Perhaps my son was finally beginning to see his wife clearly. "Well, it's too late now," Madeline snapped. "The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to let your mother destroy our future because of one small incident?" I watched through the gate as Daniel ran his hands through his hair, the gesture he'd made since childhood when he was overwhelmed. "The bank called this morning," he said. "About the second mortgage. Madeline, you told me that loan was for wedding expenses, but the payment is 3 times what you said it would be. Interest rates fluctuate, and the credit cards, all of them are maxed out. When did that happen?" I could see Madeline's mind working, calculating how much truth she could afford to tell. "Daniel, you knew I had some debt when we got engaged. I've been trying to manage it, but with the wedding expenses and setting up our new life together." "Some debt?" "Madeline, we owe over $300,000. So Thomas had been conservative in his estimates. The actual amount was even worse. That's why we need your mother's help," Madeline said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. "She has millions, Daniel.
Milio.
And you're her only child. This money should be ours anyway." "Should be ours?" "That's her life's work, her security. She's an old woman. How much security does she need? She could live comfortably on half of what she has and leave the rest to us." I felt my hands tighten on the pruning shears. The casual cruelty in Madeline's voice, the entitled assumption that my life's work belonged to her, made my blood boil. "I'm going to talk to her," Daniel said.
"No."
Madeline's voice was sharp.
"No, Daniel.
"Your mother has made it clear she doesn't want to see us. But there are other ways to handle this situation." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes family members who are acting irrationally need intervention. Legal intervention." My blood ran cold. Thomas had warned me about this. Madeline's research into conservatorship laws, her documentation of Daniel's stress and confusion. "You want to have my mother declared incompetent? I want to protect our family's assets from someone who's clearly not thinking straight. Daniel, your mother cut you off completely because of one argument at our wedding. Does that sound like rational behavior to you?" I could see Daniel wavering, torn between loyalty to me and financial desperation. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe we should try talking to her one more time."
"Fine.
"But if she won't listen to reason, we'll have to consider other options." They got back in the car and drove away, leaving me alone with my roses and the certain knowledge that Madeline's next move would be to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my assets. She had made her biggest mistake yet. That afternoon, I called Thomas Reed. "It's time," I said. "I want you to contact the police in Savannah and Mobile. Tell them where to find Madison Clark." "Are you sure? Once we make this call, there's no controlling how fast things move." "I'm sure. But first, I want to have one final conversation with my daughter-in-law." I spent the evening crafting the perfect message. Not a letter, something more immediate and personal. At exactly 9 p.m., I called Daniel's home phone. Madeline answered on the second ring. "Whitmore Residence." "Hello, Madeline. It's Evelyn." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. "Evelyn, thank goodness you called.
Daniel and I have been so worried about you.
We really need to sit down and work through this family misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I know exactly who you are, Madison Clark." Another silence, longer this time. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Of course you do. You understand perfectly. Just like Marcus Webb understood when you pushed him down those stairs in Mobile. Just like Gerald Hutchins understood when you tried to kill him in Savannah." I could hear her breathing change, becoming rapid and shallow. "I don't know what you're talking about." I think you might be confused. I'm not confused, dear. I'm informed. I know about the credit card fraud, the forged signatures, the $350,000 you've stolen from my son. I know about your previous marriages and what happened to those poor men. You can't prove any of that, can't I? Madison, you made a critical error when you chose my family as your target. You assumed I was just another weak old woman who would roll over and die when threatened. But I'm not weak, and I don't die easily. What do you want? Her voice was hard now, dropping the fake sweetness. I want you to understand that your life, as you've known it, is over. The police in Savannah have been looking for you for 3 years. They'll be very interested to learn that you're living in Charleston under another stolen identity. You wouldn't dare. I've already made the call, dear. They should be arriving sometime tomorrow morning.
The phone went dead.
Madeline had hung up. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair to wait. It was 9:17 p.m. If Madeline was as smart as she thought she was, she would pack her bags and disappear into the night, leaving Daniel to face the financial ruin she'd created, but saving herself from arrest. If she was as arrogant as I believed her to be, she would try to salvage her plan by doubling down on her efforts to control my assets. At 10:43 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Madeline standing alone on my porch. She'd changed from her earlier outfit into jeans and a dark jacket, clothes suitable for running. But she was here instead of fleeing, which meant she still thought she could win this game. I opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged. Hello, Madeline. Or should I call you Madison? Let me in. We need to talk. I think we can talk perfectly well with the door between us. Her face was different now, harder, more desperate. The sweet Southern belle mask had finally slipped completely. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she said. I've worked too hard to build this life to let some bitter old woman destroy it. Bitter? Oh, my dear, I'm not bitter. I'm methodical. There's a difference. Listen to me very carefully, Madeline continued, stepping closer to the door. Daniel loves me. He'll choose me over you, especially once I explain how you've been acting irrationally, making wild accusations, exhibiting signs of dementia. Will he? Even when he learns about the debt you've hidden from him. Even when he discovers your real identity and criminal history. Madeline's laugh was ugly. Daniel is weak. He always has been. I can make him believe anything I want him to believe. Perhaps. But can you make the police believe it? Because they'll be here in the morning, Madison. And unlike my son, they're not easily manipulated. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. You can't do this to me, she whispered. I won't let you. You don't have a choice in the matter. The wheels are already in motion. Madeline stared at me through the narrow gap in the door, her mind clearly racing through options and possibilities. What would it take? She asked finally. What do you mean? To make this go away. The police, the investigation, all of it. What would it take to convince you to call them off? I pretended to consider her offer. Well, you could start by returning every penny you've stolen from my son. Then you could dissolve your marriage and disappear from our lives forever. And finally, you could turn yourself in to face justice for what you did to Marcus Webb and Gerald Hutchins. That's impossible. Then I suppose we have nothing to discuss. I began to close the door, but Madeline pressed her hand against it.
Wait.
There has to be another way. A compromise. I looked at this woman who had spit in my face, stolen from my son, and planned my murder, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The only compromise is that I'm letting you choose how this ends, I said. You can run tonight and maybe stay ahead of the law for a while longer. Or you can stay and face the consequences of your actions. But either way, your time as Mrs. Daniel Whitmore is over. Madeline stepped back from the door, her face a mask of rage and desperation. This isn't finished, she said. Oh, but it is. I replied, and closed the door with a soft click. Through the front window, I watched her stand on my porch for several minutes, probably weighing her options. Finally, she walked back to her car and drove away. I checked my watch. 11:28 p.m. By morning, Madison Clark would either be hundreds of miles away or sitting in a Charleston jail cell. Either outcome was acceptable to me. Justice, as they say, was finally within reach. Friday morning dawned gray and misty, with the kind of Charleston fog that muffled sounds and made the familiar streets look mysterious. I was on my front porch with my coffee by 7 a.m., watching for signs of activity at Daniel's condominium across town. I didn't have to wait long. At 7:42 a.m., my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the display, but I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. By 8:15, I had received 11 missed calls from my son. At 8:23, Thomas Reed called. "The Savannah police are in Charleston," he said without preamble. "Detective Sarah Morrison and her partner arrived about an hour ago. They're coordinating with local law enforcement to serve the warrant." "And Madeline?" "Still at the condominium, as far as we know. But, Mrs. Whitmore, there's been a development you need to know about." I set down my coffee cup. "What kind of development?" "Gerald Hutchins, the man Madeline tried to kill in Savannah? He died 3 weeks ago. Natural causes, heart attack, but it changes the charges from attempted murder to conspiracy to commit murder and fraud." The weight of this news settled over me. Another victim. Another life cut short by Madeline's greed and cruelty. Are the charges more serious now? Much more serious. If they can prove a pattern of behavior, and with your evidence, they can, she's looking at life in prison. At 9:07 a.m., I heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. At 9:15, my doorbell rang. Detective Morrison was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her partner, Detective Frank Rodriguez, was younger but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen it all. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm Detective Morrison with Savannah PD. I believe you've been expecting us." I invited them into my living room and served coffee while they reviewed the evidence Thomas had compiled. Detective Morrison studied each document with professional intensity, while her partner took notes. "This is extremely thorough," Detective Morrison said finally. "Mr. Reed has done excellent investigative work. Will it be enough to convict her, combined with what we already had from the Savannah case?" "Absolutely. But, Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, why didn't you come forward sooner? If you suspected your daughter-in-law was dangerous." I set down my coffee cup and met her eyes directly. "Detective, would you have believed me if I'd called 3 months ago claiming my son's fiancé was a murderer? Or would you have thought I was just another jealous mother-in-law causing family drama?" Detective Morrison smiled grimly. "Point taken. And the incident at the wedding was the final proof I needed that Madison Clark hadn't changed. She's still the same woman who killed Marcus Webb and tried to kill Gerald Hutchins. The only difference is that this time, she picked the wrong victim." At 9:47 a.m., Detective Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. "Unit 23 to base. Suspect is in custody. No incidents." Detective Morrison nodded with satisfaction. "Madison Clark has been arrested. She'll be transported to Savannah to face charges for the attempted murder of Gerald Hutchins and the suspicious death of Marcus Webb." I felt a wave of relief, so powerful it made me dizzy. After months of fear, planning, and careful maneuvering, Madeline's reign of terror was finally over. What about my son? He had no knowledge of her true identity or criminal activities. We'll need to interview him, of course, but based on the evidence, Mr. Whitmore appears to be another victim rather than an accomplice. The financial fraud charges are complicated, though. His name is on many of the documents. That was a problem for Daniel to solve with his own attorney. I'd done everything I could to protect him from the worst consequences of his poor judgment. After the detectives left, I sat on my front porch and tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Somewhere in Charleston, my son was learning that his wife was a murderer and a thief. Somewhere else, Madeline was in handcuffs, facing the justice she'd avoided for too long.
My phone rang.
Daniel again. This time, I answered. Mom. His voice was barely a whisper. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Hello, Daniel. The police were here. They arrested Madeline. They're saying she's wanted for murder, that her real name isn't even Madeline Clark. Mom, please tell me you didn't know about this. I was quiet for a long moment, listening to my son's breathing on the other end of the line. I knew, I said finally. You knew and you didn't tell me? Would you have believed me? If I told you 3 months ago that your fiancé was a murderer, would you have called off the wedding? Another long silence. I don't know, he whispered. I do know, Daniel. You would have thought I was a jealous old woman trying to sabotage your happiness. You would have chosen her over me, just like you did at the wedding. Mom, about that night. That night, you watched your wife push me to the ground and spit in my face, and you did nothing. Nothing, Daniel. So, I decided to do something. By having her arrested? By protecting myself and preventing future murders. Madison Clark killed at least 2 men before she met you, and she was planning to kill me once she'd gained control of my assets. Did you know she'd been researching my medical history? Did you know she'd been documenting your stress levels to build a case for having you declared mentally incompetent? I could hear Daniel crying on the other end of the line. I didn't know, he said. I swear, Mom, I didn't know any of this. But you knew about the debt, didn't you? The credit cards, the loans, the second mortgage.
Some of it.
She said she had everything under control, that once we were married and you welcomed her into the family, we'd be able to pay everything off. With my money.
Yes.
God help me, yes. At least he was being honest now. Daniel, your wife married you to steal my fortune and murder me for it. The only reason I'm alive is because she got greedy and showed her hand too early. What happens now? Now you figure out how to clean up the financial mess she made of your life. And you do it without any help from me. Mom, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your son. Are you? Because the son I raised would never have stood by while someone assaulted his mother. The son I raised would have had the backbone to defend the woman who gave him life. I was scared, Daniel whispered. I was scared of losing her. And now you've lost everything else instead. I hung up the phone and deleted his contact information. Again. That afternoon, Grace Hale called to check on me. How are you holding up, dear? The whole city is talking about the arrest.
I'm fine, Grace.
Better than fine, actually. And, Daniel, I looked out at my garden, where the roses Robert and I had planted were blooming despite the morning's drama. Daniel is learning that some choices have permanent consequences. He chose Madeline over me at the wedding. Now he can live with that choice. Evelyn, he's still your son. Is he? Because the Daniel I raised wouldn't have tolerated anyone treating his mother the way Madeline treated me. The man who stood silent while I was assaulted is a stranger to me. That evening, I poured myself a glass of Robert's best wine and sat on the front porch watching the sun set over Charleston. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. Madeline was in custody, facing justice for her crimes. Daniel was free of her influence, but would have to rebuild his life from the ground up. And I was safe in my home, surrounded by the memories and legacy Robert and I had built together. The war was over, and I had won. But more importantly, justice had been served for Marcus Webb, Gerald Hutchins, and all the other victims who hadn't been strong enough to fight back. Sometimes, as I've learned, the best revenge is simply ensuring that evil doesn't triumph over good. And sometimes, an old woman with pearls and steel in her spine is exactly what the world needs to tip the scales toward justice. As Evelyn's story reaches its climax, we see how one woman's courage to stand up to evil can change everything. Her methodical destruction of Madeline's life wasn't just revenge, it was justice. But first, if this story has inspired you, please share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of fighting back. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of women who refuse to be victims. Now, let's see how Evelyn's victory unfolds. The Charleston Post and Courier ran the story on Sunday's front page. Local woman arrested in connection with multi-state murder investigation. The photograph they used was Madeline's booking photo. Gone were the perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, replaced by the harsh fluorescent lighting and orange jumpsuit that revealed her true nature. I read the article over breakfast on my front porch, savoring both my coffee and the knowledge that the truth was finally public. According to the report, Madison Clark had been charged with the murder of Marcus Webb, the attempted murder and fraud in the case of Gerald Hutchins, and multiple counts of identity theft and financial fraud in Charleston. The reporter had done their homework, painting a picture of a serial predator who had targeted wealthy older men for over a decade. My phone had been ringing all weekend, reporters wanting quotes, neighbors expressing shock and concern, old friends checking to make sure I was safe. I'd ignored most of the calls, but I did speak with Grace Hale and Richard about the legal implications. The good news is that you won't be called as a witness, Richard explained during our Sunday evening conversation. The evidence Thomas gathered, combined with what the Savannah police already had, is more than sufficient for conviction. And Daniel? Richard sighed. Daniel's situation is more complicated. Technically, he's a victim of identity theft and fraud, but his name is on many of the loan documents. He'll need his own attorney to sort through the financial mess. Has he contacted you?
He tried to.
I referred him to another firm. Given my loyalty to you and the circumstances, I can't represent him without a conflict of interest. I understood. Daniel had made his choices, and now he would have to live with the consequences without the safety net I'd provided his entire life. On Monday morning, Thomas Reed stopped by with an update on the investigation. The FBI has taken over the case, he said, settling into my living room with a cup of coffee. They believe Madison Clark may be responsible for as many as 6 deaths over the past 15 years. 6. They're reopening several cases where elderly men died under suspicious circumstances shortly after marrying younger women who then disappeared. The pattern is consistent with Madison's methods. The scope of Madeline's crimes was staggering. How many families had been destroyed by her greed? How many children had lost fathers to her murderous schemes? There's something else, Thomas said. The authorities want to recognize your role in stopping her. You're going to receive a commendation from the State Attorney General's office for your assistance in apprehending a dangerous criminal. That's not necessary. It's not about what's necessary, Mrs. Whitmore. It's about acknowledging that you saved lives. If Madison had succeeded with her plan against you, there would have been more victims. Your courage stopped a serial killer. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up my favorite photograph of Robert. He was smiling at the camera, his arm around my waist, both of us standing in front of this very house on our 20th wedding anniversary. I didn't feel courageous, I said. I felt angry and determined not to let some trailer park trash destroy everything Robert and I built. Sometimes anger and courage are the same thing. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Morrison, an elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and worried eyes, stood on my front porch holding a bouquet of white roses. Mrs. Whitmore?
I'm Eleanor Morrison.
I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. It took me a moment to place the name, and then I remembered. The woman from Savannah that Clara had overheard Margaret Whitfield discussing at my memorial service. Madeline's potential next victim. Please come in, I said, leading her to the living room. Eleanor settled into Robert's favorite chair and accepted a glass of sweet tea before explaining why she'd come to Charleston. The police contacted me last week about Madison Clark, she said. They told me I was being targeted as her next victim. I'm so sorry you had to learn about it that way. Don't be sorry.
Be proud.
Detective Morrison told me that you're the reason they were able to arrest Madison before she could hurt anyone else. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Whitmore, I lost my husband 6 months ago. I've been so lonely, so vulnerable. If Madison had approached me with her lies and charm... She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would have happened. She was already researching me, Eleanor continued. My finances, my social circle, my routine. The police found detailed files on my background among her possessions. I felt sick thinking about how close Eleanor had come to becoming Madeline's next victim. Another widow, another trusting woman who would have been murdered for her money. How did she know about you? I asked. Through the Preservation Society in Savannah. I've been a major donor for years, and my name appears in their annual reports along with information about my contributions and properties. Of course. Madeline would have studied those donor lists like hunting guides, looking for wealthy widows who might be vulnerable to her charms. Eleanor, I'm so glad you're safe. I'm safe because of you. Because you were strong enough to fight back and smart enough to gather evidence. Eleanor reached over and squeezed my hand. I came here to thank you for saving my life. After Eleanor left, I sat on my front porch and thought about the ripple effects of that terrible night at Daniel's wedding. My decision to fight back against Madeline hadn't just protected me, it had saved Eleanor and who knows how many other potential victims. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for people you've never met, but who share your vulnerability. On Wednesday, I received a call from Detective Morrison in Savannah. Mrs. Whitmore, I wanted to give you an update on the case. Madison Clark has confessed to the murder of Marcus Webb and the attempted murder of Gerald Hutchins. She confessed. Her attorney advised her to cooperate in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. She's going to plead guilty to second-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple fraud charges. She'll serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, finally. Marcus Webb's family would have closure. Gerald Hutchins could rest knowing his attacker would never hurt anyone else. And Eleanor Morrison could live without fear. What about the other cases the FBI is investigating? She's not cooperating on those yet, but with her DNA and fingerprints in the system, we're confident we'll be able to connect her to the other crimes. It's just a matter of time. That evening, I called Grace Hale with the news. It's over then, Grace said. Madison will spend the rest of her life in prison.
Yes.
And Daniel? Grace was quiet for a moment. I saw him yesterday at the grocery store. He looks terrible, Evelyn. Thin, exhausted, like he hasn't slept in weeks. The financial stress must be overwhelming. It's more than that. I think he's finally understanding what he lost when he chose silence over defending you. I felt a tiny crack in the wall I'd built around my heart where Daniel was concerned, but I pushed it away. My son had made his choice that night at the wedding. The consequences were his to bear. Has he tried to contact you?
Daily.
I don't answer his calls. Evelyn, I know you're hurt. I'm not hurt, Grace. I'm done. Daniel showed me who he really is when it mattered most. I can't unknow that about him. That night, I updated my will one final time. Every asset I owned would go to carefully selected charities that helped victims of domestic violence and financial fraud. Eleanor Morrison would receive a substantial donation in honor of her escape from Madeline's plot. Daniel's name appeared nowhere in the document. As I signed the papers, I felt a sense of completion. The woman who had tried to destroy my life was in prison. The son who had failed to defend me would inherit nothing. And the legacy Robert and I had built would help other women who found themselves in vulnerable situations. Perfect justice, served cold and calculated. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to the front porch, where Robert's rocking chair waited in the evening breeze. The street was quiet, the air fragrant with jasmine and roses. For the first time since Robert's death 3 years earlier, I felt truly at peace. The war was over, and justice had prevailed. 2 months after Madeline's arrest, Charleston's social scene had largely moved on to newer scandals. But the reverberations of that wedding night confrontation continued to reshape lives in ways both visible and hidden. I was pruning my roses on a warm September morning when Grace Hale arrived with news I'd been dreading. Daniel lost his job, she said without preamble, settling into one of my porch chairs with a heavy sigh. I continued my careful work with the pruning shears, though my hands had stilled. When? Last week. The law firm said it was due to the negative publicity surrounding the case, but everyone knows it's really about the financial mess Madeline left behind. Creditors have been calling the office, and there are liens against his salary. I felt that familiar crack in the wall around my heart, but I reinforced it quickly. Daniel's problems were of his own making. He's lost the condominium too, Grace continued. Foreclosure. He's staying in a motel on the outskirts of town. Despite my resolve, the image of my son, the child I'd raised in comfort and security, living in a motel room was painful. But I'd made my decision the night he chose silence over courage. Grace, why are you telling me this? Because he's your son, Evelyn. And because I think you need to know what your silence is costing him. I set down my pruning shears and looked directly at my oldest friend. My silence? Grace, I didn't create this situation. Daniel chose his wife over his mother. He chose to ignore the warning signs about Madeline's character. He chose to stand by while she assaulted me. He made mistakes. He made choices. And now he's living with the consequences of those choices, just as I'm living with the consequences of mine. Grace was quiet for several minutes, watching me return to my roses with perhaps more vigor than necessary. He's drinking, she said finally. The shears slipped, nearly cutting my finger.
What?
Richard saw him at Murphy's Tavern 3 nights running. He's not handling any of this well, Evelyn. The job loss, the financial ruin, the guilt over what Madeline did. The guilt over what he failed to do. I corrected. Yes, that too. But Evelyn, he's your child. Doesn't that mean something? I walked to the porch railing and looked out at the street where Daniel had learned to ride his bicycle, where Robert had taught him to throw a baseball, where we'd taken countless family photographs on Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations. All those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. It means I raised him better than the man he became, I said finally. It means I gave him every advantage, every opportunity to develop character and integrity, and he failed to use them when it mattered most. That afternoon, against my better judgment, I drove to the Palmetto Inn, the motel where Grace said Daniel was staying. It was a depressing place on the wrong side of Charleston, the kind of establishment that rented rooms by the week and asked no questions about its tenants' circumstances. Daniel's room was on the ground floor, number 127. Through the thin curtains, I could see the blue glow of a television. For 30 minutes, I sat in my car debating whether to knock on his door. In the end, I drove home without making contact. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. The next week brought news that was both satisfying and sobering. Thomas Reed called to update me on Madeline's legal proceedings. She pled guilty to all charges yesterday, he said. Life in prison without parole, as expected. But there's more. What? The FBI investigation has connected her to 4 additional murders over the past 12 years. All wealthy older men. All ruled accidental or natural deaths at the time. She's now officially classified as a serial killer. For more victims. For more families destroyed by Madeline's greed and cruelty. Did she confess to those as well?
No.
She's only cooperating on the cases where she was already caught. But the evidence is overwhelming. DNA, financial records, witness testimony from neighbors who saw her at the scenes. I thought about all those victims, Marcus Webb, Gerald Hutchins, and 4 others whose names I didn't even know. Men who had welcomed Madeline into their lives and homes, never suspecting that their kindness would cost them their lives. Thomas, I want you to do something for me. I want you to contact the families of all those victims and arrange for substantial donations to be made to causes they cared about, in their memories. That's very generous, Mrs. Whitmore. It's not generosity. It's justice. Those men died because of Madeline's greed. The least I can do is ensure their memories are honored. A week later, I received a call that surprised me. Mrs. Whitmore? This is Janet Webb. Marcus Webb was my father. I remembered the name from Thomas's files. Marcus Webb had been Madeline's first husband, the one who died falling down his own stairs. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Webb. Thank you. But that's not why I'm calling.
I wanted to thank you for what you did.
Detective Morrison told me that you're the one who gathered the evidence that finally brought my father's killer to justice. Janet's voice broke slightly. We knew Dad didn't just fall down those stairs. He was too careful, too sure-footed. But the police said there wasn't enough evidence, and then Madison disappeared, and we thought we'd never get answers. Your father deserved justice.
He did.
And more than that, he deserved to be remembered as the good man he was, not just as a victim. The donation you made to the literacy program he supported, that means everything to our family. After I hung up, I sat quietly in Robert's chair, thinking about the ripple effects of justice. Marcus Webb's family finally had closure. Gerald Hutchins could rest in peace knowing his attacker was behind bars. Eleanor Morrison was safe from becoming the next victim. And somewhere in a motel room across town, my son was learning that some choices have consequences that last a lifetime. That evening, Grace called again. Daniel tried to see you today, she said. He waited on your street for 3 hours. I had seen him. I'd watched from my bedroom window as he sat in his battered Honda Civic, gathering courage he'd never quite managed to find. Eventually, he'd driven away without ever getting out of the car. What did he expect, Grace? That he could sit outside my house and I'd run out to comfort him? I think he expected his mother to care that her only child is falling apart. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. I did care. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the silence and the poor choices, Daniel was still the little boy I'd rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers and celebrated at every milestone. But he was also the man who had watched his wife assault me and done nothing. Grace, caring, and enabling are 2 different things. I cared enough to remove him from my will before Madeline could manipulate him into giving her access to my assets. I cared enough to have her investigated and arrested before she could murder me and move on to her next victim. But you won't care enough to forgive your own son? For what? For being weak? For choosing the wrong woman? Or for standing silent while that woman humiliated and assaulted his mother in front of 200 people? Grace sighed. All of it, Evelyn.
For all of it.
I walked to my front window and looked out at the street where I'd lived for 30 years. This house held decades of memories, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, first steps and graduation celebrations, quiet evenings with Robert, and joyful gatherings with friends. But it also held the memory of that terrible phone call I'd made from the wedding reception and the decision I'd made in that moment to protect myself at any cost. Grace, there are some betrayals that can't be forgiven. Not because the person wronged is unforgiving, but because forgiveness would require forgetting. And I can never forget the sight of my son standing silent while his wife spat in my face. So, Daniel pays the price forever? Daniel pays the price for as long as the consequences of his choices last, which apparently is going to be quite a long time. After Grace hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my front porch to watch the sunset. The evening was warm and fragrant with jasmine, and the street was peaceful in the golden light. For the first time in months, I felt a moment of doubt about the path I'd chosen. Not about stopping Madeline, that had been necessary and right, but about cutting Daniel out of my life so completely. Then I remembered the sound of Madeline's spit hitting my cheek and the sight of my son's frozen face as he chose silence over courage.
Some prices are worth paying.
And some lessons can only be learned through loss. Evelyn's story is nearing its powerful conclusion, but the lessons she's learned can transform your life too. If you're facing your own battles with people who've underestimated your strength, remember, you have more power than you know. Please hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear about the courage to stand up for themselves. Now, let's see how Evelyn's journey of justice concludes. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Charleston winter that chills you to the bone. I woke alone in the house that had once been filled with holiday laughter, and for the first time since Robert's death, I felt the weight of genuine loneliness. In years past, Daniel would have arrived early with gifts and stories, and we'd have spent the morning together before joining friends for dinner. This year, my only plans were a quiet service at St. Michael's and Christmas dinner with Grace and Richard. I was arranging Robert's favorite ornament on the mantelpiece when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Daniel standing on my porch, thinner than I remembered, wearing a wrinkled shirt and carrying a single white rose. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, and something that might have been desperation. Grace had been right about the drinking. I could see it in his posture, in the careful way he held himself. For a moment, I hesitated with my hand on the deadbolt. 5 months had passed since Madeline's arrest, 5 months of silence between us. Part of me wanted to open the door, to offer comfort to this broken man who is still, despite everything, my son. But then I remembered the wedding reception. The sound of laughter dying in the ballroom. The feeling of cold marble against my back as I fell. The warm spit running down my cheek while my son stood frozen in silence. I walked away from the door. Daniel rang the bell again. Then again. Finally, I heard his voice through the wood, cracked and desperate. "Mom, please. I know you're in there. I just want to wish you Merry Christmas. That's all." I pressed my back against the wall beside the door, listening to my son beg for acknowledgement I couldn't give. "I know I failed you," he continued, his voice breaking. "I know I should have stopped her. I know I should have defended you. I replay that night every single day, wishing I could go back and be the son you deserved." Tears stung my eyes, but I remained silent. "I lost everything, Mom. My job, my home, my future. But losing your love, that's the punishment I can't bear." The silence stretched for several minutes. Then I heard his footsteps on the porch stairs, and moments later, the sound of his car driving away. I found the white rose on my doormat with a note written in Daniel's careful handwriting. For the mother who taught me right from wrong. I'm sorry I forgot those lessons when it mattered most. Love always, Daniel. That afternoon at Grace's Christmas dinner, I was quieter than usual. The conversation flowed around me. Updates on children and grandchildren, plans for the new year, gossip about Charleston's social scene. But my mind kept returning to Daniel's hollow eyes and broken voice. "You saw him today," Grace observed as she walked me to my car. "He came by the house. And I let him leave without opening the door." Grace studied my face in the porch light. "Evelyn, how long are you going to punish him?" "I'm not punishing him, Grace. I'm protecting myself from future disappointment."
Are you?
Or are you punishing yourself too? I drove home through Charleston's quiet streets, past houses glowing with Christmas lights and families gathered for celebrations. My own house stood dark and empty, a monument to the choices I'd made. The next morning brought news that would test my resolve in ways I hadn't expected. Richard called just after 8 o'clock, his voice heavy with concern. "Evelyn, you need to know about Daniel. He was arrested last night." My blood ran cold. Arrested? For what? Drunk driving. He hit a tree on Folly Road around midnight. Thank God no one else was hurt. I sank into Robert's chair, feeling the room spin around me. Is he injured? Minor cuts and bruises. But Evelyn, his blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit. This wasn't just a couple of drinks. He was seriously intoxicated. Where is he now? Charleston County Jail. He'll be arraigned this morning, but without money for bail or a lawyer. Richard didn't need to finish the sentence. Daniel would sit in jail until his case was resolved, another consequence of the financial ruin Madeline had left behind. Richard, I want you to arrange for his legal representation. Evelyn, are you sure? After everything that's happened. I'm sure. Hire the best criminal defense attorney in Charleston and make sure Daniel has proper representation. But Richard? I paused, making sure he understood my next words. This is not reconciliation. This is preventing my son from destroying what's left of his life through poor legal counsel. I understand. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, processing the news. Daniel had hit rock bottom, jobless, homeless, financially ruined, and now facing criminal charges. The proud young attorney who'd once walked down the aisle at his wedding was gone, replaced by a broken man whose wife had destroyed everything he'd worked for. Part of me felt vindicated. This was exactly what I'd predicted would happen when Daniel chose Madeline over family loyalty. His weakness had led to his destruction, just as I'd known it would. But another part of me, the part that remembered rocking him as a baby and cheering at his law school graduation, felt nothing but sorrow for the man my son had become. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Thomas Reed. I need a favor, I said. I want you to monitor Daniel's situation. Make sure he has what he needs while he's incarcerated, but do it discreetly. I don't want him to know the help is coming from me. Of course. Are you considering reconciliation? I'm considering basic human decency. There's a difference. Over the next week, I learned more about Daniel's downward spiral than I'd wanted to know. The attorney Richard had hired, James Morrison, kept me informed of his client's situation despite my request for distance. Daniel had been living on credit card cash advances and what remained of his savings. He'd been drinking heavily since losing his job, spending most days in bars and most nights in his motel room. The accident had been the inevitable result of a man trying to drown his guilt and shame in alcohol. He keeps asking about you, Morrison told me during one of our conversations. He wants to know if you've been told about his arrest, if you're disappointed in him, if there's any chance for forgiveness. What do you tell him? I tell him to focus on his legal situation and let family matters resolve themselves in time. But would they? I'd built a wall of silence around my heart to protect myself from further hurt, but that same wall was preventing any possibility of healing. Daniel had betrayed me, but he'd also been the victim of a master manipulator who destroyed everything good in his life. The question I couldn't answer was whether justice required permanent estrangement, or whether mercy might allow for eventual forgiveness. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone in my living room with a glass of champagne, watching the fireworks over Charleston Harbor. At midnight, as 2024 became 2025, I made a resolution that surprised even me. I was going to visit my son. Not to forgive him. I wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready. But to see for myself what my silence had cost both of us, and to decide whether the price was worth the principle. Justice, I'd learned, was a complex thing. Sometimes it required punishment. Sometimes it required mercy. And sometimes it required having the courage to face the consequences of your own choices, even when those choices had been right. The next morning, I would drive to Charleston County Jail and look my son in the eye for the first time since his wedding day. What I would see there and what I would decide to do about it remained to be written. But for the first time in months, I felt ready to turn the page. January 2nd dawned clear and cold, with the kind of bright winter light that makes everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. I dressed carefully for my visit to the jail, a simple black suit, my pearl necklace, and the dignified composure I'd worn like armor for the past 6 months. The Charleston County Detention Center was a gray concrete building that radiated institutional despair. I'd never imagined I'd visit such a place, certainly never to see my own son behind bars. The intake process was humiliating by design: metal detectors, searches, paperwork, and a waiting room full of people whose lives had intersected with the criminal justice system. I sat straight-backed in a plastic chair, surrounded by weeping mothers and anxious wives, and wondered if I was making a mistake. Daniel appeared on the other side of the reinforced glass, looking like a stranger. Jail clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and his face showed the toll of months of self-destruction. But it was his eyes that shocked me most, hollow, ashamed, and filled with a grief that seemed to encompass everything he'd lost. We picked up phones simultaneously, and for several moments, we simply looked at each other through the glass barrier. "Mom," he said finally, his voice cracking on the single word. "Hello, Daniel. I can't believe you came. After everything I've done, everything I've failed to do, I never thought I'd see you again." I studied his face, looking for traces of the boy I'd raised. He was there, buried under layers of poor choices and broken dreams, but still recognizable to the woman who'd loved him first. "You look terrible," I said. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "I feel worse. Mom, I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what happened at the wedding, but I need you to know how sorry I am." "For which part? For choosing Madeline over me? For standing silent while she assaulted me? For the financial mess you created? Or for ending up in jail?" Each question landed like a physical blow, and I watched Daniel absorb them with the stoic acceptance of a man who'd stopped making excuses for himself. "For all of it," he said quietly. "For being weak when you needed me to be strong. For trusting someone I should have seen through. For disappointing the mother who deserved so much better from her son." "Why, Daniel? Why did you choose her over me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes unfocused as he considered how to explain the inexplicable. "Because I was scared of being alone," he said finally. "After Dad died, I watched you handle everything with such grace and strength, and I felt inadequate. Like I'd never measure up to what he was or what you needed me to be. I felt something crack inside my chest, not the wall I'd built around my heart, but something deeper and more painful. So when Madeline came along and made me feel needed, wanted, important, I grabbed onto that feeling and refused to let go, even when I should have seen the warning signs. The warning signs were impossible to miss, Daniel. I know that now. But at the time, I convinced myself that your concerns came from jealousy, or from not being ready to share me with another woman. I chose to believe her lies because they were easier than facing the truth. And at the wedding?" His face crumpled. "At the wedding, I froze. I saw her push you, saw her spit on you, and my mind just stopped working. By the time I processed what had happened, you were already walking away with Mr. Hale and Mr. Reed. You had days afterward to call me, to apologize, to choose differently. I did. And I chose wrong again. I chose to believe Madeline's story about wedding stress and misunderstandings because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd married a monster. Through the glass and phones, I saw my son clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the successful attorney with the perfect life, but as a weak man who'd been expertly manipulated by a predator. Daniel, Madeline didn't just steal your money. She stole your judgment, your integrity, your ability to distinguish between right and wrong. That doesn't excuse your choices, but it explains them. Does it matter? I've lost everything anyway. My career, my home, your love. You never lost my love, I interrupted, surprising us both. You lost my trust, my respect, and my willingness to enable your poor decisions. But you never lost my love. Daniel pressed his hand against the glass, and for a moment, I was tempted to match the gesture. But I kept my hands in my lap. Mom, is there any chance, any possibility, that we might find our way back to each other? I looked at my son through the barrier that separated us, literal and metaphorical, and considered the question I'd been avoiding for months. I don't know, Daniel. The damage is extensive. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. But not completely impossible? Not completely, I admitted. But it would require you to become a different man than the one who stood silent at your wedding. It would require you to develop the backbone and integrity you should have had all along. I want to try. I want to be the son you deserve to raise. Wanting isn't enough. You'll have to prove it through actions, not words. And that process will take years, not months. Daniel nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever it takes. We'll see. I stood to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped me.
Mom, wait.
There's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said months ago. What? Thank you. For stopping her. For protecting yourself when I wouldn't. For making sure she couldn't hurt you or anyone else. I looked at my son one last time, seeing both the man he was and the man he might become if he found the courage to change. You're welcome, Daniel. But I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was right. As I walked out of the jail into the bright January afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of hope. Not forgiveness, that would take time and proof of genuine change. Not reconciliation, the relationship we'd once had was gone forever. But perhaps, eventually, we might build something new from the wreckage of our family. Or perhaps not. That would be up to Daniel and the choices he made going forward. 6 months later, I received a letter postmarked from a rehabilitation facility in North Carolina. Daniel had served his sentence, gotten sober, and was working to rebuild his life far from Charleston's gossip and judgment. Dear Mom, he wrote, I'm writing to let you know that I'm learning to become the man you tried to raise me to be. It's harder than I expected, facing the truth about myself without alcohol or excuses to soften the edges. But I'm doing the work one day at a time. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for financial help or a place in your life. I just wanted you to know that your son is finally growing up, even if it happened 20 years too late. I love you, and I'm proud to be your son, even if I haven't earned that privilege. Daniel. I read the letter twice, then placed it in the drawer with Robert's important papers. Not an answer to his unspoken questions, but not a rejection either. As I told him at the jail, some healing takes time. That evening, I sat on my front porch watching the sunset, wearing my pearl necklace and feeling the weight of choices made and consequences accepted. Madeline was in prison where she belonged. Daniel was learning to stand on his own feet without my financial support. And I was safe in the home Robert and I had built, surrounded by the legacy we'd created. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that right prevailed over wrong, that predators faced consequences, and that vulnerable people were protected. Sometimes it required cutting away the diseased parts of your life to save what was healthy. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those diseased parts found a way to heal themselves. The story of that terrible wedding night would be told in Charleston's social circles for years to come. But it wouldn't be remembered as the night Evelyn Whitmore was humiliated and defeated. It would be remembered as the night an elegant lady in pearls proved that even the most refined Southern woman has limits, and that crossing those limits comes with a price that can never be fully paid. And that, my dear viewers, is the end of Evelyn's incredible story. A tale of betrayal, justice, and the power that comes from refusing to be a victim. If Evelyn's courage has inspired you, Please like this video and subscribe to her true stories for more incredible tales of women who stood up for themselves. Remember, you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more powerful than anyone who tries to diminish you. Your story matters, your voice matters, and you have the right to demand respect from everyone in your life. Until next time, keep fighting, keep believing, and never let anyone make you feel small. This is Her True Stories, where every woman's voice is heard.